Welcome to today's mystery lecture. My name is Gottfried Hagen. I'm the former director of the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies and the current chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies. I'm standing in for Juan Cole, the current center director, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So today's lecture, we have this sort of just a map of Saudi Arabia and a sort of mysterious name, Iffat, Thunayan. So I think many people will have probably wondered what this is about. So the person to lift the veil, so to speak, from this is our guest, Dr. Joseph Kechichian, who's a senior fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. He was also running a consulting company based there that provides analysis of especially the Gulf countries and sort of the entire Arabian Peninsula. Dr. Kechichian received his doctorate in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia, and he went on also to teach and an administrative career there. Also taught at UCLA for a while, but he also soon went to work for a number of prominent think tanks, including the Hoover Institution and the Rand Corporation. He's a regular presence in the media, from Al Jazeera English to BBC and NPR. He has published very productively, starting with the book Succession in Saudi Arabia in 2001, and then there comes a whole series of books largely centered on the political system in various countries in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other Gulf states. Another sort of plus accompanied by a large number of articles on current affairs. A project that also piqued my interest was a study and translation of a famous 12th century mirror for princes, the Sulwan al-Muta' fi Udwan al-Atba' of Ibn Dhafar al-Siqilli. And with the project that he's going to present to us today, he's again stepping on new territory, a biography of a queen of the Saudi kingdom, Iffat al-Thunayan. We are very curious what you have found out about such a person who's usually so kept secretive. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kechichian.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. It's not every day that people get together to listen about an Arabian queen, especially one that hails from a country that's often in the news, but often for the wrong reasons, allegedly for creating tensions and fueling all kinds of fires. Now, I've been asked to speak for about half an hour, 45 minutes or so, but before I do address the topic of the book itself, what I wanted to do is take just a few moments to tell you why I wrote this book. As you've just heard, it's a bit off my regular beat, so to speak, because the 11 books that I have written so far, this is the 5th on Saudi Arabia, have all concentrated on the political realm, and my specialty is succession matters, and I've concentrated on that subject for several years now. But when you spend several years working on a particular topic, you can't but develop a certain understanding towards the subject unless one sets out to smash it. Setting out to write about a woman who lived in a segregated society was even more challenging than I assumed, however, and truth be told, I did not set out to embark on a crusade to either denigrate or to laud Iffat al-Thunayan. I was simply curious to discover who this person was, who left her mark on King Faisal, a subject that fascinated me ever since I was a little boy when I saw the king first at the Beirut airport in those days the terminal access was free, and about whom I composed a book back in 2008. My research on Faisal hinted to the fact that Faisal's greatness really stemmed from someplace else. And lo and behold, I discovered that it was Iffat al-Thunayan who was really behind the power, behind the throne in many respects. I was curious to find out more about this woman. But as a man, I did not realize when I set out on the project how challenging it would be. Although the Queen's female offspring were worthy legatees who welcomed my systematic, even quite intrusive questions, others were not as forthcoming. And since I needed to interview many women who worked at the institutions Queen Iffat created, in other words, complete strangers to me, there were a few hurdles to cross. Those of you who know how difficult it is to navigate in that kind of an environment will appreciate the efforts that went into it. And those who don't know will hopefully discover some of its more charming consequences if you read the book. Suffice it to say that it took a small team to identify potential interviewees, make various arrangements to secure appointments, persuade them that male American researchers would be asking personal questions even if several received me wearing full niqab, face cover, travel to their destinations, exchange traditional greetings in what is still a highly conventional society where women do not mingle with strangers, especially males, and gather original materials about a person adored by most of the folks who knew her. My interviews with several elderly women who knew Iffat al-Thunayan very well and who could tell me many stories about her, and they did, was something I will never forget and that I tried to share in this book. Of course, I was impressed, though my chief hurdle was to be careful and eschew a hagiography. Because I did not know the Queen, and I never met her, I could only see her photographs, read a few letters she composed, and heard her voice over a family session mischievously recorded by one of her grandchildren. Over the course of multiple interviews with 53 individuals, itself a formidable challenge, it became rather clear that many were truly envious of the late Queen's abilities to function, even shine in Saudi society. Now, as the book will soon be published in Arabic, March 2016 in Beirut, Dar Riyadh al-Rayis, many Saudi women and hopefully many Saudi men will discover their Queen. That knowledge is a great recompense to me as the conservative society struggled with reforms that, truth be told, are likely to change it permanently. In fact, my primary audience for this book are not Saudi women. My primary audience, I hope, are going to be Saudi men so that they figure out and they understand what it means to be a Saudi woman. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me just take a few moments here to tell you a little bit about who this woman was, where she came from, what was her background, before I touch on 3 or 4 key developments in her life during the period that she lived in the kingdom between 1932 and when she passed away in 2000, the things that she did. But obviously, this woman, as her name indicates, al-Thunayan, is part of the cadet branch of the Al Saud family. She was not an Al Saud, she was one of the cadet branches. And of course, the Al-Thunayan, about 200-300 years ago, used to be a leading tribe in the central province of Najd in Saudi Arabia, ruled for a while. But the clashes that occurred in those days with the Ottoman Empire were such that the Al-Thunayan and the Ottomans were at odds, and the Ottomans wanted to abscond and kidnap as many of these folks as possible, and they succeeded. Iffat's grandfather, a man by the name of Abdullah bin Abdullah al-Thunayan, don't be confused by the two names being similar. It just so happens that the kid, Abdullah, took his father's name because his father passed away the night he was born. So therefore, they named him after his father. So the Ottomans, thinking that the young boy was the father, they took him and the entire family as hostage and took them to Constantinople, which eventually became Istanbul. Istanbul took its name in 1930, as you know. Before then, it was Constantinople. Therefore, Iffat's father, Muhammad Saud, was actually born in Constantinople, and he was inducted into the Ottoman army. He was a physician and fought in the war as a soldier and died on the battlefield during World War I. We suspect someplace in what is today Iraq. I tried to find the military records, but obviously the Ottoman empires are not accessible. So therefore, I could not really identify where this soldier passed away. Suffice it to say that when she did not return from the battlefield at the end of World War I, the family was in a destitute situation, and Iffat's mother, Asia, who was half Cherkess, she herself, therefore Iffat is half Cherkess because Asia was Cherkess woman, married her next door neighbor who happened to be an Albanian police officer by the name of Adham. So therefore, Queen Iffat has a half brother and a half sister from that relationship. But obviously the situation in the Ottoman Empire as the Ottoman Empire collapsed was financially impossible. So the family decided to write a letter to the founder of the kingdom, Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman, erroneously known as Ibn Saud. There is no such person as Ibn Saud. It's Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman, saying, please take us back. We're family. We'd like to go back to Saudi Arabia because we don't see a future for us here. The response comes back and says, you're most welcome to return. Why don't you come for the pilgrimage for Hajj? This is happening around January of 1932. And therefore, Iffat, at the age of 16, she and her aunt, Jawharan, make the trip back to Mecca. Of course, in those days, there were no airplanes, so you had to go by boat. And the trip from Constantinople to Jeddah took approximately 2.5 months. It was a long trip, but eventually she made it. And who was at the airport receiving, at the harbor receiving her? The viceroy of the Hijaz, who happened to be Faisal. Eventually, Faisal, who will become the third king of Saudi Arabia, Faisal meets them. Obviously, it's family. You know, she's meeting a cousin, a lost cousin, nevertheless. He is smitten by her because she is a superbly attractive woman. And within a matter of 2-3 weeks, they married, and he sends off a telegram to the father in Riyadh telling him, congratulate me, I married our cousin Iffat al-Thunayan, we're on our way to seek your blessing. Obviously, the guy was not going to say no, but Faisal was a fast mover, and he was a smart guy because he knew what hit him. What hit him was opportunity. Now, there are lots of mythologies about Iffat al-Thunayan that Robert Lacey and other historians have delved into, blaming the fact that King Faisal was a womanizer and that he was on one of his trips to Constantinople. He found her there, he fetched her. This is all nonsense. And hopefully the record now will be set straight that in fact the first meeting between the two occurred in January of 1932 in Jeddah and eventually Mecca. And what's important about the relationship of this first trip is that, one, Iffat was not alone when she came. She was with her aunt, Jawharan, who was a handicapped person, probably from polio, in a wheelchair. The story is very important, and I will come back to it in a few moments. Bear in mind that, therefore, this young woman at the age of 16 had already the experience of looking after a handicapped individual and what that would do to her later on, to her ideas about introducing the kind of fundamental reforms in Saudi society. And the second point is that even though she is from Arabic origin, Iffat knew very little Arabic when she arrived in Saudi Arabia, spoke very few words of Arabic. And of course, King Faisal spoke very few words of Turkish. Even though the Ottoman Empire had a great deal of impact, the relationship between the Ottomans and the Arabs has never been optimum. So therefore, she did not know how to communicate with him, and he could not communicate with her. At the beginning, it was pretty tough. Later on, of course, she learned Arabic, and she became very fluent, although she spoke with a very heavy accent. That's why they called her al-Turkiyya, the Turkish one. But she never let that handicap stop her. On the contrary, she knew how to use a handicap to her advantage in more ways than one. Now, I could go on and tell you more about the details, but I'm going to save the juicy parts of the encounter for those of you who want to read the book. Hopefully, this presentation will perk your interest into picking up a copy of the book and really discovering an amazing, a really amazing personality about whom so little is known in reality. What I'm going to do, however, for the balance of my time, is to talk about some of the fundamental changes that she introduced. Now, let me identify 4 areas which I will talk about. I will talk first and foremost about education. Then I will talk about health issues that she was concerned about. Then I will talk about financial matters that she delved into. And I will conclude by saying a little bit about women's conditions, women's condition in Saudi Arabia, because obviously she left an impact in all 4 of them. When she passed away in 2000, among her papers, family members found a teacher's certificate from Constantinople. That is, that she had brought with her when she came in. Iffat was destined to actually become an educator, but she never told us to anyone throughout her lifetime. Her daughters, whom I've interviewed for the book, her granddaughters, her sons, none of them knew that in fact she had this teacher's credential. Therefore, this is important because here you have a relatively sophisticated young lady at the age of 16 who had already some training in what was, at that time, probably the most sophisticated Muslim city. I mean, Istanbul at that time, Constantinople, was the place. Mecca was a backwater in those days. So obviously when she comes in, she is shocked as what she sees. It's not like today. It's quite a different story. So therefore, this woman has been interested in education from the very beginning. When she comes in and sees what's going on, the only kind of education available at that time was religious education. That muftis or the mufti and the sheikhs, the local sheikhs, will essentially habituate young men in exclusivity, more or less, to memorize the Quran and regurgitate the scriptures. She wanted something totally different. Not only she wanted to have girls receive an education, but she wanted non-religious education to be available as well. So therefore, she created the first high school called Dar al-Hanan, or House of Affection, which is taken from the scriptures, since the scriptures clearly states that every believer must educate themselves. So she starts the school. It's a very small affair, and it fails. Total failure at the beginning, because no self-respecting family is going to send their daughter to a boarding school, not only to be exposed to foreign ideas, but at the same time to be exposed to foreigners, which is unheard of, even in the Hijaz in those days. Egyptian, Palestinian, Jordanian, Lebanese teachers that were brought in. Iffat does not let this deception stop her. On the contrary, she renews her activities, her efforts, and refurbishes, finds from the social ministry an Egyptian woman by the name of Cecile Rushdie, and brings her into the system, so to speak, and restarts the school. And it takes off from there. But what she does this time, she puts her own daughters in the school as well. So the first students are the Faisal daughters in the school, which means that the rest of the ladies of Jeddah, and we'll see, oh wow, you know, Iffat and Faisal are putting their daughters to the school. Let's emulate them. Let's do likewise. Later on, of course, she would create a university by her name, and those of you who read Arabic will appreciate in the appendix of the book I included her letters to the king and the heir apparent, how she requested permission to start the women's college. I've discussed it in some detail in the text of the book, but I wanted to keep the originals in the book so that people can appreciate her language, how she actually asked for this permission. This becomes evident in a few seconds when I talk about other matters, financial matters. But she operated within the system. She made sure that she got what she wanted to gain, starting the college and which now is a university, exclusively for women, although there are some men now who are studying jurisprudence at Iffat University, but more or less she really started a new phenomenon in the kingdom. That was not the last one, since now we have the proliferation of universities, both private and public, that are quite common. The second question is about health. Now, as I told you, Jawharan al-Thunayan, her aunt, was handicapped, and she made sure that always at her majlises, at her gatherings, Jawharan will be wheeled in and put next to her, so that the rest of members of society would see that it was no longer taboo to deal at a level playing field with handicapped individuals. Unfortunately, in Muslim societies, for centuries, not just in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere as well, handicapped individuals were not seen. They were kept away. Not anymore. And I think one of her legacies is the fact that she created all these charities and clinics and medical facilities that were available to a wide group of people so that they could have access to proper medical facilities as well. In the book, I discuss the Help Center, which is a prominent handicapped school in Jeddah. And even though it is totally an independent, has nothing to do with her, has nothing to do with any official government, but the idea of the Help Center came from Iffat al-Thunayan, because the person that created the Help Center was a regular member of Iffat's majlis and watched firsthand Jawharan's treatment and asking themselves questions, why shouldn't we also take care of our own, making sure that we create the institutions that will be that will facilitate life for these unfortunate citizens of the country. Now, health issues, of course, in those days when she came into the kingdom, 1932, 1940, health was rudimentary, to put it mildly. It's not like today. Today you have very sophisticated hospitals, to the point where, God forbid, if you are in a car accident or you suffer from a debilitating cancer that requires you to have reconstructive surgery over your face, or in a car you lose half of your eye, and so on and so forth, what do you do? What do you do? Where do you go for these things? Well, if you happen to live in the United States, you go to Cleveland. There is only one hospital in this country that does that kind of surgery. If you happen to live in Europe, you go to Germany. In Munich, there is a similar hospital. And if you happen to be in Asia, you go to Tokyo. There are 3 such major university hospitals around the world. Guess what? There is a 4th one in Riyadh called the King Khalid Eye Hospital, which is at par with the other 3. And even though Iffat did not create that hospital herself, obviously not, because the hospital was created after she died in 2000. But nevertheless, she set the mindset and the mentality so that people start investing at home, start putting money in the resources at home, create the infrastructure and the manpower that is needed. Incidentally, this hospital that I'm talking about, which is separate from the Faisaliya specialist hospital, they're everywhere now, this hospital is not manned by foreign physicians. It's half and half. Half of the physicians and the professional staff people that I have met were all Saudis. So there is great strides that are being made in this area thanks to her. Investment, the third point, financial issues, was also very critical for her. Obviously, as a princess at the beginning, later on queen, she had access to the privy purse of the monarch. She could spend whatever money she wanted, right? There would be no shortage of cash if she wanted something. And Iffat was an extremely generous person. She would splurge. When she wanted to get something done, when she had a project in mind, it didn't matter how much it cost. Money was not important. The important thing was to get things done, to invest. So therefore, she would distribute generously, and she was a very wise manager, very wise manager. In fact, if she were not a queen or a princess, she would probably handle a Fortune 500 CEO of a major corporation. She was that wise. What did she do? She took some of that money that was hers, instead of splurging on jewelry and all kinds of other things that, generally speaking, princesses do, she invested. She invested in income-generating properties, hotels, business towers, a variety of income-generating properties that brought in additional money independent from the privy purse that she had access to. Now, the question is, why did she need to have this extra money? What was the point of this? I'll let you know. Of course, I'm not going to tell you all the details here because I'm going to leave some room for your discovery. But what she did is that she kept ledgers and made sure that she was fine-tuned to what was going on in Saudi society, reading the social pages very carefully, making sure she knew about various families, what was going on inside the families, whether there were funerals, there were marriages, there were births, and so on and so forth, and instruct her attorney once a week to make appropriate donations as the circumstances warranted. In other words, she invested in people, and of course everybody knew that this money was coming from Iffat, simply because the attorney took it upon himself to go and present the check or cash, whatever it was, in whatever form it was. So therefore, this is a woman that invested in Saudi society. She knew how to manage wealth. And of course, her majlis was open. People could come in at any time they wanted, and the doors of the palace were never shut. This was one of the few palaces that the doors never actually closed. They stayed open 24 hours a day. Anybody who wanted to walk in could walk in, even if they were not there. They will be received, they will be fed, they will receive a gift before they left. So therefore, we're talking about a savvy person that knew how to manage finances. Now, put the finances aside, but make the link as to what kind of access that gave her, and through her, King Faisal, to what was going on in Saudi society. Obviously, people would come in, share their grievances, if there were any, share their ideas, complain about certain things, or make sure that the ruling family members knew what was going on in society. So therefore, this was an incredible mechanism to fine-tune yourself to what was going on inside Saudi society. There are lots of other examples that I could give you, but because of time, I'm going to continue. We'll come back during the question and answer period to some of these questions. The fourth point that I want to touch upon is women's affairs. In the book, I discuss in some detail how Islam perceived women, especially since Iffat al-Thunayan was a practicing Muslim who took her religious duties quite seriously. She seldom wavered from her core beliefs, and even as she pushed for dramatic changes in the ways her daughters, and all Saudi girls and women for that matter, behaved and were treated in the segregated country. Though extremist elements hijacked much of this discussion in recent years, Iffat was a modernizer in the Islamic sense of the word, which is to say she wanted to adopt the optimum means to benefit recipients and refused to see Islam as a faith that shackled women to subservience. The only kind of submission she backed was that to God, which applied equally to both men and women, and it was critical to ascertain her views on two important questions, namely the customary veiling of Saudi women and the quest for gender equality. She herself did not wear a veil. Incidentally, you may or may not know this, but the abayas that are worn by Saudi women, it's a recent phenomena. 1979, really. Before 1979, it was quite fashionable for Saudi women to actually have the abaya folded around their arms. It was to the knee, and then the rest was folded around the arm. And of course, the shawl or the veil that many women wore in those days was a item of luxury. People could not afford to buy these things. Not every woman veiled because this was very expensive, and it was only the fashionable and the wealthiest members of society who could actually afford to buy these silk-made, very, very expensive items. But that's besides the point. She did not wear the veil. Of course, when she stepped out, she put a shawl over her head to cover herself from any troublemakers in the neighborhood. But the moment she was in private, obviously the veil came off. She did not believe in it because she did not believe that this was an Islamic code of dress. There was nothing. Because in Islam, piety and modesty applies to both men and women, not just to women. Men must also be as modest as women must be. So therefore, she saw the hypocrisy in it, presumably, and she said, I don't want to play this game. And she did not play this game. And Faisal accepted that. In fact, there are pictures of the two of them that is an amazing photographs of her at state dinners at the Champs-Élysées, at the Élysée Palace in Paris, for example, when President Georges Pompidou received them on an official state visit, and she is wearing Western clothes, a very nice Lanvin dress with a chignon on her head that really, as I told you, she was an exceptionally attractive woman as well. But this was all done in private. Obviously, it was not done in public. Now, the second point about gender equality is also important. As I said, in the book, I discuss in some detail all the mechanisms that she had to go through in order to acculturate religious clerics that had the monopoly over women's education, to actually allow them to have schools and educate as many women as possible. Now, you might think that this is easier said than done, and that she's the queen, she can just, flip her fingers and things will happen. No, things don't happen like that. There are procedures in place, and there are mechanisms to follow, and there are certain rules that one must abide by, for lack of a better term. However, because she was such a strong believer, and because she took her religion seriously, she could actually argue on religious ideas meritoriously with the clerics. What she would do, for example, she would call in one of these clerics to her majlis, sit down with them, and argue, and give and take, exchange ideas, and say, you know what, this is what we're going to do. And I need your help. I need your support. And you know, and I know, that the scriptures don't say any of this. Let's work together. Let's make sure that we invest in our young people so that they benefit from the system that we have, instead of ostracizing them and segregating them further. She used her charm, she used her savvy, she used her ideas and her brain, and more important than everything else, she used her persuasion skills that were immense to actually change mentalities, and gradually she changed. It was not always easy. There were lots of people opposed to her. In those instances, when she hit a wall, obviously she would go to Faisal, and Faisal would never say no to her, because Faisal was besotted by her, no question about that. To the idea, let me give you an idea how bad he was, how badly in love he was with her. He would actually let her walk ahead of him. When they went into a room, she walked first, and the king followed. Unheard of. The king follows nobody. Faisal followed Iffat. That's the kind of esteem that she had. And of course, everybody in the family watched this and saw this, and her value increased dramatically to the point where, not only because she came from a sophisticated society and she was knowledgeable and she knew how to talk to people and she knew what to say at the right moment, but she was also smart in ways that other members of the family at that time were not. Let me give you an example. during World War II, for example, they had some maps brought in about the various theaters on the European battlefronts. So they hang all these maps on the wall, and they would all sit, the king, the senior members of the family, the brothers, sister-in-laws, you know, all of them as a family gathering. They put the radio on to listen what was going on this battle, and on that battle, and she would stand up and show them where these places were, because she knew how to read a map. She was the only one at that time who had that kind of skill, because she had done that when she was in preparation for her teacher's certificate. So therefore, her value increased dramatically in the family, and she was one of the few people that started to have mixed dinners, whereby men and women would sit down together at the palace and share a meal. She would attend Faisal's majlis as a woman, not the segregated majlis that she held for ladies only, but she would also go to the king's majlis with other senior members of the family, where they will have a conversation. And every time somebody had a particular question about things that they wanted to do for education or health or whatever, people would turn to her. What do you think? What's your opinion about this? She didn't talk much, but when she talked, boy, did she spill out what she wanted to say. She was a very, very strong character. Now, I get all this information, obviously, from family members who were totally in love with her, but also from the chief of protocol of the ruling family, several of the assistants that she had that are still alive, several of the women, for example, that created the charities that she founded and funded at the same time. So I've gathered all this information from these 53 people, put them together. The final point that I want to talk about is the role of women, beyond the veiling and the gender equality. It is a fact of life that today, still, Saudi Arabia is a segregated country, where in Islam, as I'm sure some of you know, there is a concept called ikhtilat, mixing. Ikhtilat is forbidden in Sharia law, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in any Muslim society. Ikhtilat is forbidden. Although, from a religious perspective, the ikhtilat that the scriptures talk about is not the segregation that we see today. It's the ikhtilat of ideas. It's the ikhtilat of behavior. It's not the fact that a man and a woman could not sit together and work together, for example. But over the centuries, customs and traditions have reinterpreted ikhtilat, because you had some sheikhs or some muftis issuing certain fatwas that transformed the dogmatic principle that was supposed to be wholesome into something that is what we have today, which is segregation. But guess what? This is changing, whether people like it or not. And sooner than a lot of people assume. Just to be blunt about it and to put it out there, fewer and fewer Saudi women are accepting these conditions, especially the younger generation. Young Saudi women are not happy with the fact that they can go abroad and drive or work with their male colleagues in Dubai or in Beirut or in Cairo, and they cannot do it in Saudi Arabia. Strangely enough, many of the graduates of Dar al-Hanan and Iffat University, women that are qualified, that have gone on to get on higher degrees, today run multi-billion-dollar financial institutions in the kingdom. And I've interviewed several in the book. One of the beauties of this book is that it's also based on the testimonies of 22 young women, graduates of Iffat University, where I was stationed for 2 years when I was writing the book. And to me, these young women really represent the future. Iffat will be proud of them. Iffat would really be proud of them, because they represent essentially what she wanted the Saudi woman to be. Now, having said this, however, I am realistic enough to realize that the judicial restrictions that are in place are not going to change overnight. It's going to take a little longer. But Queen Iffat, and I will close with this, Queen Iffat attempted to create a solid modernizing environment for Saudi women so that they could articulate ideas to society, add values to their communities, and enjoy the fruits of life as best as possible. She also worked hard to share her own perspectives, which hovered around loyalty to crown and country, at a time when Saudi nationalism was not clearly defined. Chapter 2 of the book is titled A Pillar of the Al-Saud, and it is my contention that she was the gel that brought this family together and kept it together. Without her, the Al-Saud today would be something different from what we have. I stand by this assessment. In short, she worked to empower those who wish to be stronger, pushed for an institutionalization process to the hilt, and shaped mentalities that were either reticent to move or too timid to act. As such, therefore, she was a true modernizer who did not fit the classic theory of someone who copied from others, but one who adapted to circumstances as necessary because she instinctively understood that society needed, in a sense, a homogeneous culture in which people were inducted to be able to do business with each other. There was a simplicity to her approach that stood out. This approach did not mean that the search for such modernity was necessarily the search for secularism, or that it needed to dislodge the very idea that Islam and modernity were incompatible. In fact, her entire life proved that the search for material and spiritual progress were compatible, as she legitimized women-only public spaces by using an Islamic discourse. On the contrary, she viewed segregation as necessary in the conservative public milieu, but she rejected restrictions on ikhtilat in private, as I mentioned. The Queen's objective was to add value whenever possible so that Saudi women could benefit from what was offered them. It might sound that that's a bit condescending, but in the environment in which she is operating, she did not perceive it as such. Now, because of their, and this is the last word, because of their unique relationship, it may be safe to conclude that Queen Iffat al-Thunayan and King Faisal bin Abdul Aziz shared a joint vision as well, which focused on empowering both men and women to add value to the kingdom. Speculation regarding the monarch's reliance on his spouse to advance women's causes or on the Queen to unduly influence her husband to introduce permanent changes in the traditional society were probably both incorrect and largely irrelevant. More importantly, the Queen's mission after the monarch passed away did not end. He was assassinated in 1975. And even if her successors assumed their fair share of responsibilities. Iffat al-Thunayan knew that his legacy was intrinsically tied to hers and vice versa, and never did anything to jeopardize either. She knew that her late husband was not the type of person who indulged her for the sake of pleasing the spouse, though he was smitten with her, as I said, but because he seriously wanted to see the Saudi women innovate her participation in society too. He knew, as she did, that the country needed every individual's skills, cognizant that those skills required acute development. To say, therefore, that the royal couple formed a harmonious duopoly that shared deep convictions about the future of the country would indeed be an accurate description. That's all I want to say, and I'm happy to answer questions you may have.